Okay. Yeah. Thanks for the invitation and the two presentations in advance. I kind of have I feel the need to go freestyle, but I don't sleep very much these days, so I'm going to kind of work through a paper, I think, or the beginnings of one. I've taken the idea of the public editorial meeting, though, kind of seriously, that this is not work that I've developed before, and I'm interested in sort of working through it with other people. And particularly, I wanted to go to the question of the pedagogy of the we, and how we learn to be we, and not in an abstract way, in a very specific way. And in doing so, wanted to revisit, I suppose, my own pedagogical history on some level, and thought back to many years ago when I was a student of geography and introduced to the theories of post-coloniality and the aftermath of the so-called West that had constituted itself through its violent occupation and displacement of people. It was a moment in which we were to turn our attention from the main show, from the capital W of the West and the N of the North and the S of the South, to a new vocabulary, the interstice, the in-between, misogyny, the other. Anne McClintock in those days argued against the monolithic umbrella that post-colonial had become. She was critical of the implications of such temporal demarcations as pre and post, then and now, to the lives of many for whom it represented a premature celebration. She advocated more complex terms and analysis to deal with the complexity that cannot be served under the single rubric of one term. And with Henry Louis Gates for a multiplication of margins, the multiplication which would, argued Gayatri Spivak, allow for a dissection of both the failures of decolonization and provoke the question of the who of decolonization, enabling us to view in some clarity the neo-colonizations of the present. I encountered these thoughts while I was deeply embedded in a solidarity struggle with the Ardoch Algonquin First Nation and allies, who were then called AFNA, in central Canada. We, students from the university, were adopted into and supporting Howard Perry and Bob Lovelace in their work to reconstitute the former occupants of a very small piece of land who had been there since time immemorial, in their terms. The community had been displaced through fires widely known to be set by the Ministry of Natural Resources earlier in the century, as well as by coercing other nearby Algonquin communities to cede the land to the government in spite of its use by the Ardoch Algonquin community, who had routinely refused to cede land or accept the terms of the colonial authorities. Howard was among the last remaining Algonquin residents of Ardoch. He had lived with the settler community for most of his life, and he and his family quietly practiced their language and custodial activity, such as rice harvesting and sustainable hunting and fishing practices. After an earlier battle to save the wild rice they had planted during a 19th century famine from commercial harvesting in the 1980s, a decade later, at age 65, he decided to find all of the children who had been adopted out of the area by governmental authorities as a result of fires in the dispossession process. At the same time, he had begun hunting, fishing, and harvesting rice from the territorial lake without a permit and outside of the designated hunting season to get himself arrested and push a land claim through the court cases, or through the courts. His claim was significant because Ardoch Algonquins had refused to cede land in the treaty process. They were designated as non-status, that is to say, not Indian, not a we, and not the people. In this process, he and those of us who were involved in the case were asked again and again by the courts, the lawyers of the Ministry of Natural Resources, the press, and indeed by other activists, who is AFNA? Who do they represent, and by what authority? Are we at the table with representatives of the people? Where are the people? Apart from the audacity of this question, given that the people had been effectively disappeared by the very same authorities, the question was a demand for a performance of a we that could be read, heard, and examined through and by colonial authorities, a we that was no matter for the birds, the rice, or the paddle that moved itself through the lake. No title for an emerging constituency whose histories and in some cases indigenous background had remained a secret for most of their lives, and no word for the definition of territory understood by Harold and his family in the naming of rivers whose waters changed the shape of the land with each passing day. By no accounts was this we to include a bunch of undergraduates, a paralegal chief, and a philosopher who had been adopted by Harold as native, some white settlers and families who until recently had never met. This we that I had come to be a part of, displaced, reuniting, adopted out, complex, illegitimate, not a community at all, inhabited this post-colonial condition at the same time as experiencing all of the violences of the colonial West in its bureaucratic management and administration of the everyday question around the people. Incredibly, at the hands of a judge on the verge of retirement and thus significantly more candid about the horrors of the colonial project than most, Harold won this case and title to the land, but in many ways through a concession, through a crafted performance of the we, that we as researchers had played a role in, convincing the authorities that the people, by colonial definition, that is to say hierarchical, blood-based, and governable, had come to exist. What I learned in this constellation of experiences of reading, making, struggling, and becoming was the myriad of differences between the we constituted by what Sweli Rolnick, after Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari, called the macro-political entities of the state, colonial and linguistic power, and the many we's that exist across the divides in grassroots struggle. Harold and Bob, drawing a lot from Algonquin epistemologies, once explained this to me, that in struggle, we, a non-native university undergraduate researcher, a 65-year-old hunting renegade and his adopted son, and the rice harvest we attempted to protect were the people. In one moment and in the next, we would include the occupiers of the land who had become over time allies, and in the next, perhaps the encounter between himself and those who had been displaced. All of these we's would exist, however, alongside and forever in the shadow of that other we, the one necessitated by colonial process and dramatized by the symbolic and spectacular demands for identification at every turn. And I think Nina was speaking about some of those demands that come from the state. This scenario will seem familiar to many and has been theorized, but the question of how we navigate these macro and geopolitical we's, the ones that we are constituted by, but also from whom we slip away, and sort of Harold's we's, the we of the micro-political and the minor entities, transversal, moving across the human and other than human, in which we spend the vast majority of our lives, is still a relevant one to consider, I think. And I'm going to switch for a minute because for many years I've been trying to answer this question about this relationship and also where one positions oneself in struggle, how one learns to struggle, and how one succeeds. And I have searched for what Isabel Stengers describes, I think, as an ecology of practices that skirt around, below, above, and away from the gaze of these macro-political entities and the need to understand opposition to them in terms of always representable spectacles of opposition. I look for this not because I'm not opposed, or not because I'm opposed to such spectacles, because I've participated in many of them and joyfully so, but because in my experiences they are usually eruptions of longer-term trajectories of quiet and less audible encounters of lives lived and crossed, of unpredictable constituencies and coalitions between human and other than human things. Among the ecology of practices that serve as navigational coordinates for my own work and the various we's in which I find myself are a set of pedagogical histories that, like in the informal education experience of becoming with AFNA, stretch across identifications and positions in struggle, convening subjectivities and learning in moments as they are necessary. This ecology of practice, which I sometimes call thinking with conditions, reaches across the 20th century, across geographical and existential territorial divides, and while there are many differences among them, they share a quality as responses to what Stengers also describes as the issues that force thought, situated struggles at the encounter between politics in its less immersive context and the political as it is constituted by monolithic laws of the letter. When I try and map these coordinates, they are many, and I do so through their linkages, drawing a line, for example, between Paulo Freire, a communist disenchanted with the arrogance of the metropolitan vanguard of Brazilian party comrades, and that of neocolonial adult education paradigms, from him to the freedom fighters in El Salvador. Both used Freire's practices in which learners and teachers question the conditions of education and the contradictions of their lives in the process of learning to read and write or engage in participatory research activities. In the case of Freire, such strategies were used also in the process of consciousness raising in what he describes as a pre-revolutionary moment. Whereas in El Salvador, similar strategies were used as part of the revolutionary process, people learning to read and write while engaging in armed struggle. This line would extend then to Nicaragua, where literacy movements sat at the center of Sandinista policy, or to Mexico, where they recombined with the words and research of Ivan Illich and Third World Participatory Action researchers who abandoned the university to engage in research with the people. To Toronto, where exiled refugees from these movements trained trade unionists, anti-poverty activists to fight NAFTA and the acceleration of neoliberalism, and me. From these movements, we might draw another line between Frere and the Soviet educator Nadezhda Krupskaya, whose writings appear in Frere's library and who wrote extensively on the role of children's self-management in emancipatory education. And from she to the French activists, educators, Elise and Célestine Freinet, communists who, like Frere, had fallen out with party comrades, this time for their insistence on linking communist education to the analysis of the contradiction of the factory, rather than to the myriad of possibilities of that working class people might invent for themselves. At the center of the École Moderne movement that in France that they founded was a pedagogy in which children would learn to read and write by writing free texts on their relationship with their environmental surroundings, the contradictions between their realities and the institution of the school and other social institutions, and their own desires analyzed through their participation in self-management school councils. These student and teacher texts were physically produced through the use of the printing press, a standard feature of all École Moderne schools, so that the language that was learned in its material and immaterial forms and findings could be circulated amongst other schools. We might draw another line between Freinet to the brothers Uri, Ferdinand, and Jean, who took aspects of this pedagogy, the printing press and self-empowered group work, the free text and analysis of the relations between desires and environments, into the fields of young adult education and the psychiatric clinic, respectively. We could draw a line from there to Félix Guattari, a student of Ferdinand Uri's young adult education programs, to the programs who, among other people, took the Freinet ideas of self-management, the pedagogy of the printing press, into the political work of a 68 generation of activists. And then another line between Frere and the Highlander School, where people in the civil rights movement went to train and to meet intersectionally, where, for example, Rosa Parks, Ella Baker, Kathleen Cleaver, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee used Highlander as an organizing space as well as a pedagogical space, influencing the development of the freedom schools in early 1960s Mississippi, which then fueled a number of solidarity struggles across the U.S. And I'm sort of going through these very quickly, but only to talk about a kind of we that gets constituted, I think, for those who are engaged in struggle of sort of moving through these histories, not nostalgically necessarily, but to draw from their sort of daily struggles and their technologies and techniques in order to understand a we in the present. And a final we brings me to the Edgware Road, which is where I'm going to end the presentation, which is a we kind of emerging from, drawing from the pedagogy and the theology of liberation up to Italy, where priests influenced people like Danilo Docci, who then in turn trained social activists who came to England, such as George Grotius, who on the Edgware Road, where I'll sort of situate this presentation a little bit more specifically, trained young people in the 1970s to become co-researchers of their own realities and constitute a we that could then speak out in relation to authorities that were kind of shaping their lives. So this we, or this space of the Edgware Road, is an important place to land for me, having spent the last 6 years working there, but also because it's a point that largely people talk about as being an engagement with the East in the City of London. and I think this is always very interesting in terms of kind of how these representations of space and we coalesce, given the fact that the Edgware Road still sits on a landmass that is owned and was bequeathed to two entities by King Henry VIII. That is the aristocratic property development family of the Portmans and the Church of England. and that this space of the so-called East also sits on an important history of both 300 years of public torture in the Tyburn Tree and the space that is applauded as the center of the freedom of speech in the so-called civilized world, which is Speaker's Corner. And is also home to this police station, Paddington Green, which is where many of those who are suspected of terror are interrogated and often tortured. And equally the site of property development, which takes place in 3 different areas of one fairly small part of the city that has come as the result of massive displacement projects bringing together major corporations in order to repopulate the we and of the people of this space. So in a number, so this is sort of a kind of meeting of so-called East and West, and interestingly, we have to ask the question: what skirts around these kinds of definitions? How do we refute the paradigms that call such a configuration into being? Whether they be a contemporary art gallery who want to add a Middle Eastern flavor to their all-consuming terrain, or a property developer whose concession to multiplicity would be to rebrand this neighborhood Little Cairo while displacing all of the migrant businesses. This has been the subject of the Center for Possible Studies, which is an off-site project space developed by myself and others over the last 6 years through a contradictory and parasitic relationship with a hegemonic neoliberal cultural institution in London's West End. The Possible Study, a mechanism to enable the minor histories and pedagogies in the area to create more audible and visible practices in response to the issues that force thought. That is, to think with the conditions of the local area, an area plagued with the gentrification programs and regular intensive policing of migrants. Broken into a number of studies, the Center for Possible Studies, which has occupied a number of buildings through and also the frameworks of contemporary art, property development, and historical research to engage in very long-term studies of the possible. And these studies of, there's the hegemonic cultural institution. Sorry, I forgot to put that slide up earlier. Anyway, so 5 minutes? Okay. Yeah, so these studies include, and these, I brought up this kind of these histories of other pedagogical programs very specifically because they come to bear in the work that has happened over time, and they're ones that have been directly referred to. For example, a block study that convened artists, business owners, cafes themselves, and workers in dispute of the of who sort of owns this land and the property on the Edgware Road, and in their development of kind of historical archives around their contribution to the area that they use to then fuel their conversations, trying to be able to stay in the area because of this. The process of the property development is quite aggressively trying to get rid of them using very racist language and processes of policing. And this particular study has sort of manifested in a series of table mats and things that enter into the neighborhood, also to share the plans of the developers with local people who are trying to engage and often are not being told what's about to happen. Second study is specifically around policing and the policing of sex workers as a lens through which to understand the forces of gentrification in a neighborhood. The Crosstalk Project are a group of sex workers who engage in their own participatory research for and by sex workers and refuse paradigms of representation of the charity sector, or what they would call the rescue industry, and also of the art world. So refuse, for example, to have artists in residence work with them, to engage in documentary making about them, and engage in sort of self-representational acts as and when are necessary. Or another study about drawing specifically from Grotius and his work in the neighborhood in the 1970s, working with young people to talk about how work could be reconfigured around the kind of work they're interested in, which largely in the end is work resisting the gentrification process. So how could they become workers, critical workers in struggle against the very processes that are shaping their lives and future. Or a study around particular policing around migration, which has linked a number of histories, both in terms of political theatre as well as political struggle against the police through a project where migrant groups come together with artists to create direct action theatre pieces that can intervene into the migrant policing that's taking place under the name Operation Condor in London right now, which is ridiculous, but is a kind of operation to go into migrant spaces that are coded culturally, like Latin American workers' centers or Latin American dance clubs, and do kind of mass arrests and deportations. So how could this study is about how can theater and visual tools intervene in that, and we've worked quite a bit with the Anti-Raids Network, which is exactly intervening in the moment in which the police raids happen, so sharing information but also stopping the raids by virtue of placing we's or bodies in front of the police. And also reflecting back on the relationship between these kinds of practices and the host institution and the contemporary art world that has framed them to some extent. This, for example, is a theater piece developed by people in the theater group about a kind of fictional scenario where a group of diplomats or aristocratic cultural workers are meeting in a ball, and where the workers revolt and sort of drop their trays and take over the space, and as a kind of fantasy, but potentially also a kind of rehearsal for another set of possibilities. So I think there are fundamental problems with this kind of work. I should also say, also working with a group who are people who have been dehoused on this question of challenging the kind of we's that have been asserted under the big society rhetoric. So there are a number of conflicts that emerge through this. And there is a fundamental problem, in addition to the very survival of such practices in the contemporary art world as it moves its whims onto other surfaces, is that the we that is related, there is always a we that is excluded. The me of this presentation, the you of this listener, the we of this room, as I represent this work and its relationship to the many we's who are not present, but also the we that is inferred by the question of the people. It is on this point that the issues that force thought have not found power in their articulation as much as they need to, and crucially need to do so. Thanks.